Hi, everybody. Welcome. If you have a chance, go ahead and share this video right now. This might be the most important video that you see in the next week. So go ahead and hit the share button so that your friends and family can see what's going on with issue 3 and give them an opportunity to learn more and understand when they go vote on May 4th on yes on issue 3. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to go through several different background information about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We're going to talk about the Cincinnati's investment in affordable housing. What does that look like currently? What does that look like in the future as well? And we're also going to talk about the ideology that's coming out of City Hall regarding housing policies and the need that we face here in Cincinnati. And in the second part, we'll focus in on issue 3 and to really see why the funding and the governance and the protections that it creates create a stronger and safer Cincinnati. So our Affordable Housing Trust Fund was established here in Cincinnati in 2018. And this came after years and years of advocacy from folks at Affordable Housing Advocates and just people throughout this community who have recognized that we have a dire need for affordable housing. And at that time, there was a somewhat substantial but small chunk of money put in there regarding the sale of a railroad here in Cincinnati. And currently there is just about $1,300 in the capital fund, which includes a $1,000 one-time gift. The short-term rental tax is collected by the city each year, and then they can make a decision about how much they put into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. But in 2018, it did not create an oversight board, which was one of the parts of the initial legislation that we had proposed, and it also did not create dedicated funding. So this was only a partial affordable housing trust fund in that in 2018, it actually created the bank account or the accounts that could collect the money, but then the city itself cannot spend that money. So there needed to be a board to be able to direct that money. Now, currently, the city of Cincinnati invest in affordable housing through a program called NOFA, or Notice of Funding Availability. And these funds mostly come from federal sources, and the city's actual amount that they put into it is very little, probably around $1 million a year of the $6 million that goes into NOFA. And NOFA is generally just used to fill gaps in financing after a project is already off the ground. So it is not at the beginning of the project that NOFA money comes in. It's really at the end of the project when all the other financing has been picked up. And it only is a small amount of the total project costs, and they can be used to create new units or to preserve units. And again, these are usually in tandem or along with other funding sources like LIHTC, which we'll talk here about in a second. But the city makes wild claims about how many units NOFA creates every year. So for example, in 2019, these are the projects that received NOFA funding. And two of the projects that received the most, that equal the most for the number of affordable units, as you can see in this column here. So 0 to 60% AMI is considered affordable. And the Arts Apartments has 250 of the 350 that the city claims every year, and another 56 for Vilcoman. And I should note that we don't know the exact amount, the AMI for the Alaska project. So that's the 22 there. So when we look at this, you can also see that the percent of contribution for that project is very low. And many of these also contain market rate units. So whether at 80% AMI, which is market rate, or above that, this created about 200 or help facilitate about 200 of those units. So when we look at those, we want to kind of break down this 2019 claim that there's 350 units created by the city of Cincinnati. So really quickly, we can just look at two examples of why it is faulty for the city to say that they've created 350 units in that year. One is the Arts Apartments. And now the Arts Apartments was scheduled to be sold, and the new owner was going to flip it and turn it into market rate. And fortunately, the tenants got together and they worked with legal aid and other folks, and they were able to preserve it as affordable. So it is now LIHTC, which means that it has income limits. So some people are not going to be able to live there, that we're actually even organizing to keep it affordable. They saw it was so important to keep it affordable that even if they themselves couldn't live there, it was important for someone to be able to have affordable housing in the West End at the arts apartments. And so OTR Community Housing, over there on Community Housing, stepped in to help function those LIHTC credits. And ultimately, though, it doesn't represent a gain of affordable housing, right? So they were able to preserve the building. It was originally organically affordable, which means that it was just affordable to people. There was no subsidy, but it was just affordable to people in the community. But now it is subsidized affordable. And when we look at Willkommen as well, which is here and over the Rhine, we see that this is a mixed use. There's some business parts to it as well. It's a mixed income. Most of the units are market rate, and it utilizes the LIHTC credits, and it received the NOFA. They also got some public land sale in that for $1 for each parcel. And ultimately, though, in the existing buildings from Willkommen, those buildings had existing LIHTC contracts, and those contracts were removed from those buildings and put on other existing units. So it actually represents a net loss. We actually lost units because of Willkommen. So when we go back to this, if we take out the 250 units from arts apartments, the 58 or so from Willkommen, this 350 number seems way smaller, right? And again, we're talking about 7 plus 13 is 20. These 22, we're not exactly sure what level they are, plus 4. So you're talking about 24 units that the city provided some amount of funding for, and that would be new units or come on the market. And the reason this is an issue is because the city loses so many units of affordable housing every year. So for the city and its the city manager's recommendations on affordable housing, for them to say we create 700 units of affordable housing in 2019 and 2020, the 350 that we were just looking at, we can see that that claim is spurious at best. But when we're talking about affordable housing, we mean 0 to 60% AMI. And I'll show you some of those numbers here in a minute. But we know that the greatest need and the people who are most likely to experience homelessness are people at 0 to 30% AMI. So keeping that in mind, we want to make sure that the fund, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, matches the need of the people that need it, the people that need it the most. And sometimes you'll see 80% as listed as affordable, but really that's because they do this thing called income averaging. And so you can have like a 30% unit and an 80% unit. And as long as those two units average at 60% or less, then they're able to get the funding as an affordable housing unit. So when we think about this, it's really simple. It's not difficult, okay? So 0 to 60% AMI, as you can see on the right here, this is what is considered affordable. And of course, AMI is the person who makes the least, the person who makes the most, that household, the household that makes the least in the county, because we're using county AMI here, the person who makes the most, the person right in the middle is 100% AMI. So 60% AMI is 60% of half the people, okay? But anything over 60% AMI is considered market rate. So sometimes you'll hear workforce housing. That's just another form of market rate housing that's 80 to 100% AMI. Now, AMI can be tricky, and people, have long discussions about which AMI should we use. And we chose Hamilton County AMI, which means that somebody would be able to pay about $429,000 at 30 or $429 per month for rent at 30% AMI. At 60% AMI, these are folks who can afford $858. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I really highly recommend checking out our 201 training that we do with the Homeless Coalition. We can come do it for your group. We also do public trainings as well. I would look out for those next month. So keeping that in mind, we chose the Hamilton County AMI because these are the folks who are going to need have the most need, right? We know they're the folks that are paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing. So when we think about what is the city doing and what does their policy look like and their ideology, right? So ideology, kind of the belief system that it has, and it's making decisions upon those belief systems. So when we look at this ideology, we can see there's three fallacies that I'm going to point out to you right now. So the first one is this fallacy that more market rate housing equals more housing affordability. So it's this idea that housing is just simple economics, supply, and demand. And unfortunately, the authors, the city manager's office, didn't fully read the reports that they cite. Because if they did, they would realize that those economic models are based on cities that are not Cincinnati. If you have an aging housing stock built before 1965, it explicitly says that model does not apply to cities like Cincinnati. And it also doesn't take into account our lived experience, right? We know that in communities like Walnut Hills and Over the Rhine and Corryville and Mount Auburn, there has been a lot of market rate housing come in, but no one's seen their rent go down, right? Have you seen your rent go down in those neighborhoods? Of course not. And it also doesn't consider the history of anti-Black racism in this city and how that affects where people live and how they're able to find affordable housing and what kind of discrimination that people face while they're looking for affordable housing. And so these theories, which we call neoliberal, that we're trying to privatize public wealth and let the public take the risk and the private get the gain, it really restricts Cincinnati's ability to respond to affordable housing. So this ideology has an impact. It's not just about the policy that's created, but it's about the possibility of ways to respond to the crisis. And another fallacy that they keep pulling out is that if building density and height limitations were removed, and then affordable housing would increase. And we've seen, though, that all the time, Cincinnati gives out what are called variances, meaning that you can make it as high as you want and you can make as much density as you want. And it's pretty much just the way we do things. We just give those out. So they're not really being restricted by height or density variances because those variances are limitations, because those variances are being given out all the time. And we also want to make sure that when they say things like Elm and Liberty could have had more affordable housing if they got the density that they wanted, which is what many city council members said, we know that's not true either, because we were sitting at the table with the developers at Elm and Liberty from the very beginning, and they demanded and said, we will not put affordable housing in this site. Even though we've created affordable housing all around this country, we started as an affordable housing organization, we at Elm and Liberty, we do not want to have affordable housing at this site, which is kitty corner to the new FC Cincinnati Stadium. So where there's $350 million in investment going across the street, they know that this is not really that big of a risky investment for them. So understanding that the other part of this is that when community councils are able to weigh in on projects, one of the ways they can do that is say, we do appreciate and we want this density variance, or we don't like the height of this building, we don't think it fits in with the community, and at least that voice would be there. Unfortunately, the city is looking at removing both the community voice, but also these restrictions under this ideology that it will somehow create an incentive for people to create housing, which will overall, even if it's market rate, their belief from the last slide, right, is that if they create market rate housing, that there will be more affordable rate housing. So the other fallacy that always comes out is that tax abatement doesn't negatively impact the availability of affordable housing. And I put this in here because most people know that there are apartment complexes and buildings all throughout our community, whether that be in Avondale and East Priceville and Walnut Hills, that are being bought out, and those residents are being forced to leave because in Ohio, we do not have very strong housing protections. And so those buildings are then flipped into market rate buildings, and then the rent goes up and those residents have to leave, right? We see it happen all the time. Unfortunately, our city actually incentivizes that through the abatement process. So what the abatement was designed to do was to get outside of Cincinnati investment to come inside the city of Cincinnati and then do repairs on buildings. And then the abatement, what it does is it allows them to pay the taxes as if the building hadn't been repaired, right? So they come in, it's got low taxes on it, they kick everybody out, they raise the rents, they bring a whole group of new people in here, generally white people with generational wealth that are coming back in from the suburbs. And they don't have to pay the full taxes on that for 10, 20, or even 30 years, depending on their environmental impact. And what that does then is it incentivizes people being pushed out of their homes. And it also creates a possible shortfall for the amount of taxes that would go to the public schools and other social services. And there could be a little bit of changes with this program. They recently kind of capped the amount that you get abated on the amount of the property value, essentially, that you get abated. But there could be things that are, instead of it being 100% abated for 15 years, it could have a graduated abatement. But also just remembering that these abatements are to encourage outside investment in our city, which then often results in changing affordable units into market rate units. So this has led to this housing crisis, right? If we continue on this path, the crisis is going to continue to get worse. Now, in Hamilton County, we know that we're over 40,000 units short of affordable housing. And this means that people are paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing. That's simply what it means. And so we also know that Black families in Cincinnati are 50% of them pay more than 30% of their income towards their housing. And over a quarter of them, 25% of them, spend over 50% of their income towards their housing. And when you do that, you are not able to participate in community life. You can't invest for the future. And you're what is called being cost burdened or rent burdened. And Black residents are way more likely to be cost burdened. And that has to do with, historical racism, segregation, redlining, continued discrimination in housing and jobs, income discrimination, all that kind of stuff. And here in the city of Cincinnati, even though you might be hearing some reports from an economics professor from UC who should be fired for negligence and malpractice, we know that in Cincinnati, this is based upon the American Community Survey, that 48% of all renters in Cincinnati are spending more than 20%, or I'm sorry, more than 30% of their income towards their housing. So that means 48% of all renters are spending more than 30% of their income towards their housing in the city of Cincinnati. So that means that there is a huge crisis. If half of the renters do not live in an affordable housing situation, then they're unable to participate in community life, and 22% of homeowners as well. So kind of keeping that in mind, that leads to overflow capacity of shelters, that where most families, over 90% of families on average day, are turned away from the cap line with no help. They're not getting shelter diversion. They're not getting into a shelter. And across the country, less than a quarter of all people actually get the housing assistance that they deserve, that they could qualify for. And that's because, since the 1970s, we just started cutting public programs for housing. This idea that people want a hand up, not a hand out, was a way for the government to say it's not our responsibility. Let's let the churches deal with it. And so what we have now is a system that cannot fully respond to the need because of the lack of affordable housing. And so people are left in situations where they're paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing, and that includes your utilities. And that also includes people with disabilities, elderly folks, families with children, the people who need the housing the most. And we can see that the number of meals are increasing at places like Our Daily Bread. And overall, the city of Cincinnati loses more than 1,000 Black residents every year. And this is by design, right? Because of those tax abatements, because of the anti-Black racism that exists in housing, exists in education, exists in the workforce, right? So because of this, we are in desperate need of housing protections as well, so that people can't just get pushed out, so that an outside developer can come in and say, hey, I want to get this tax abatement. I'm going to flip this house into market rate. And you'll see when you look at, if you look at apartments for sale and stuff, buildings for sale, it'll say like, rents below market, you could easily bring this up to market rate, right? So they use that as a selling point. Or you might see tax abated to 2028, right? So you'll see that as a selling point as well, because that program, abatement program, incentivizes turning affordable units into market rate units. And so because of that, we need to have protections that need to be addressed both at a local level, but also at the state level as well. So we should make it, if someone can pay their rent and they're getting evicted for non-payment, that if they're able to pay their rent, they should be able to stay there. And we should have a housing court. So that meaning that when people are going to court, that there's representation on both sides, there's education programs and all that kind of stuff. And we also just need to make sure that there's a response to discrimination that people are experiencing. And so we could even move into things like rent caps or increase caps and rent control and stuff like that, because what's happening is that the cost of living is going up so much more than what the wages are, that no matter what, you're going to get caught in the crosshairs. And like I just said, 50% of Cincinnati families are spending more than 30% of their income on their housing, which means they do not have affordable housing. And so because the wages are so low, with minimum wage being $8.80 in Ohio now, that means you can afford about $460 a month on your rent, and that also includes your utilities as well. And so you'd be hard pressed to not spend at least $100 to Duke Energy every month, right? So you're looking at an apartment that's $375, and imagine that you're a full-time minimum wage worker with a kid, and there's nowhere in the United States where you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment working minimum wage. And this also doesn't take into account what is taken out for taxes, or if you're paying into a healthcare through your employer, the premiums and all that kind of stuff. So they look at, when we say that someone can afford $460 a month, that doesn't include the fact that their insurance might be taken out of their paycheck. Their taxes are certainly taken out of their paycheck. So understanding that the actual real amount is probably going to be less, that they would be able to feel. They'd be able to feel that. And so since the last economic recovery, mostly low wage jobs were created. And of course, we know in this country, and COVID really showed this, is that Black workers were the ones that were having these low income jobs, the only opportunity for them. And many of them were taking on 2 or 3 jobs at a time. And so what issue 3 does is it ensures, as you can see on the bottom, that all persons hired to construct, renovate, or operate any unit supported by the fund must be paid a living wage consistent with the city's current wage or living wage ordinance. So when we think about this, and we know that this is a big issue, there's 3 areas that I really want people to think about and focus on, and that is the funding, the governance, and the protections that are offered by issue 3. And this is really important. This isn't just a discussion of, we have differences about the way things should go. This is about whether or not we're going to address the affordable housing crisis or not. Okay, that's what this is about. Are we going to choose to address it, or are we going to continue the way that things have been going as business as usual? And that's really up to us on May 4th when we go to the ballot box, for those of us who live in the city of Cincinnati. And we'll talk a little bit about what's at stake too, as well. So with this, we know that the funding will guarantee at least $50 million a year to go into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And this represents roughly about 3% of the entire Cincinnati budget, because the money can come from a lot of different options, and it can create new funding sources as well. But ultimately, this is $1 billion issue. The fact that we're short over 28,000 units of affordable housing in our city, you might think, oh, 50 million, that seems like a lot. But really, that is it's gonna make a marked difference in our communities, but understanding that this will help catapult us into being able to finance more affordable housing that will remain affordable forever. So we think it'll be about 500 to 1,000 units supported every year, but it will be a flexible fund, meaning that the board will be able to determine that it will be likely funding these things. So rental and mortgage assistance, home repairs, maintaining affordable housing, building new units, financing, helping out with gap financing, helping out with financing to reduce the debt or the interest that a project might have. So the funds can be used for a lot of different things, but they're dedicated to affordable housing. And that's really important because when we think about this and we look at this, we understand that the half of the funds are going to go to 0 to 30% AMI, and all of the funds will be spent at 0 to 60% AMI. Using Hamilton County's AMI, that means at 30%, at least half of the funds will be supporting households that make $17,000 or less, and all of the funds will support households making $34,000 and less, which is actually a big group of Cincinnati households. Over 40% of Cincinnati households make $34,000 or less, right? So this is a very widespread issue. And this issue 3, by voting yes, you can help 40% of our neighbors to make sure that they have more stable and more affordable and safer housing. And these units will remain affordable forever. So that means none of the units would be cost to the end user more than $858, right? So it will be affordable, but half of it will be for households that are able to spend about $430 a year. So we know what $430 a month for the rent. And so we know what the affordable levels are, right? This isn't just it's affordable to some people, not everybody, but this is affordable to families making under $34,000 a year. So we purposely left it open and up to the city government to figure out, how do you want to fund this? Because we knew that it's going to take multiple funding sources to be able to fund this. So it's not just going to come out of the general budget. It's going to be able to provide different options, whether that's a developer fee, which we'll talk about that, or an impact fee. We'll talk about that in a second. Taxing the stock options. So I guess people have stock options. I don't really know what that's about, but that's a big deal. They could take it out of the capital funds as well. So we have a huge capital budget. Some of it is restricted, some of it's unrestricted. They could create a new source, but that has to be city funds. We can't just funnel in state or county or federal funds and say, hey, we're funding this trust fund. And as you heard at the beginning, there's pennies in this trust fund as it is right now, right? So, I say pennies, but $1,300 is pretty sad that that's how much is in our has been added to our trust fund. Besides that initial sale of the railroad, besides that there's $1,300 in this. It's 3 years later. And this shows you what dedication our city has put into it. And I will say that most likely they're going to reinstate the 0.3% earnings tax that was reduced because we moved Metro sorta to the county level. But I think, this is why it says opinion, I think that the most equitable thing to do would be to do the impact fees. And an impact fee basically says, look, you're putting market rate development in here. It's having an impact on the communities. You're either directly or indirectly displacing residents, as we see all the time. We see when buildings are bought and then they're emptied out and they're turned into market rate housing, or they're building on an empty lot. That still creates what's called indirect gentrification and pushes people from the community. And so that development has an impact, a disparate or a negative impact on the community. And so the city would be able to collect a fee on that. And it is legal in the state of Ohio for cities to do that, for municipalities to do that. A village cannot do that, but a city can do that. And it's kind of a type of inclusionary zoning, saying, look, if you're not going to include affordable housing in your development, you could pay into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And we saw this happen with Elm and Liberty. They said, we do not want to put affordable housing here, but we'll put $750,000 into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund sometime in the future, but we won't give that to the streetcar. That's a whole nother story. But this would only cover a portion of that 50 million need, but it requires an ideological change at City Hall, because as you can see in this quote at the bottom, their belief is that the price of housing in a particular market is driven by the basic economic forces of supply and demand, which is a white supremacist policy because it excludes race from this. And we know in a city like Cincinnati that has deep entrenched racism in our institutions, in our interpersonal actions, understanding that if we do not center race and equity at whatever we're doing, we are failing, right? We're failing future generations as well. And ultimately, when you hear that, oh, if we vote yes on issue 3, it's going to cut the fire and the police, and you're only going to get garbage once a month, this is because a city council member asked the city manager to write a report that said specifically, it said specifically, if we took $50 million from the operating budget, then what would that look like? Okay, that's what they were asked. They weren't asked to say, hey, if issue 3 passes and we need to come up with $50 million a year, what would you do? Okay, that is not what they asked. They asked, if we just slashed and burned, what would that look like, right? And so this has been used to mischaracterize this amendment, to say our amendment or what we're trying to do is defund the police and make things unsafe and all that kind of stuff. But that wasn't even what the city manager was asked to do. They were just said, look, take out $50 million. What does that look like, right? And we even saw the Supreme Court in Ohio was split on this decision because they said it's okay because they said it could impact the funding. If it said would impact the funding, we wouldn't allow it, right? And so understanding that some of the things were taken out of the ballot when the city council changed what it actually says on the ballot, the things about things being illegal, they said that city council and the city, really it was the Board of Elections because they submit it to the state, were trying to dissuade voters from voting for this. And so one of the things that we know is that new funding sources are encouraged, so they can come up with new funding sources. And if we look at what happened last year with COVID, there was a $30 million deficit. Now, some people were furloughed and it was awful and difficult for people, but somehow Cincinnati police received raises and even got $1 million extra at the end of the year after the budget hearings happened. So they didn't cut the police. I mean, they're not going to. All right, so don't be fooled in thinking that that's what's going to happen, okay? And if it does, they'll just say, well, it's their fault over here, right? You know what I mean? They're not going to take responsibility for it. So what is Cincinnati trying to do? So the city manager put out a recommendation on affordable housing, and this was after the Elm and Liberty debate back in January. Someone asked one of the council members, said, hey, can you come up with a report or recommendations on affordable housing? And then we submitted our petition to be on the ballot. And then city manager's office likely looked at our petition and then modified their recommendations based upon our petition. But one of the things that they're proposing is opening up what's called a Section 108 loan pool, and it's a HUD fund, and it's a loan that the city would take on, and it would reinstate what's called the Build Cincinnati Loan Pool, and it would be administered by a nonprofit Cincinnati Development Fund. And they would also ask corporations and foundations to put up money, but of course, that's likely going to have some strings attached. But this $34 million for the Build Cincinnati Loan Pool, we already had that. It just expired last year in 2020. We've already been using this and we're still in the crisis that we're in. So this doesn't actually create something new. They're not restricted funds, so they can create parking garages, they can create luxury housing, they can create business spaces with it. And we've seen a recent example of that was 3CDC's 4th and Race Tower. You also have College Hill Station, the Walnut Hills Redevelopment Foundation's acquisition of the Kroger building in Walnut Hills. And essentially what this does is say, look, we can have trickle down housing, right? If we make luxury housing, then that's going to increase the affordability, right? That's what they're saying. This will increase the affordability. So when we look at the luxury apartments at 4th and Race, you can see that, they do have really great amenities like a pet grooming spa. very important. A cyber cafe, concierge service. I actually cut off, there was more things on here, but you can see the studio apartments are starting at about $1,400 a month, one bedroom $1,500, and a two bedroom at $2,700 a month to rent, right? And then again, this is that idea of this trickle down housing. So ultimately, the reason why City Hall's plan fails, and we can look at this and we can think, what is it going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is that they do not want to dedicate funding to affordable housing. So if they get the funding through private sources, if they get Section 108, that does not require the funding to be put towards affordable housing. In fact, you can see at the quote at the bottom, they're just kind of proposing that at least 50% of the funding from Section 108 would go to create housing that is available to low and moderate income individuals. But that Section 108 does not say it has to go to create housing, low income housing, okay? They can build it, like you just saw on 4th and Race, to build parking garages and luxury houses as much as they want. They could build, 100% of that, because that quote at the bottom, I do not think actually got into any of the legislation that was passed last week, because they actually did pass this idea to go ask HUD for this $34 million loan. And again, this relies on this trickle down ideology that if we build more market rate housing, somehow that's going to create more affordable housing. And it's the same thing that they've been doing. I mean, there's no innovation with this. So now we know with issue 3, we know that the funding can come from different sources, but it will be dedicated to affordable housing for people making 0 to 60% AMI, about $34,000 a year. And we know that our fund, our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, is well researched. I mean, we spent years, we started on this endeavor back in 2016. We worked with people from all over the country, including Baltimore and other cities that have established Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And we found out that the best way to do this was to have this 11-person board that has 4-year terms and that are nominated by professional organizations like Affordable Housing Advocates, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, the Homeless Coalition. There's a couple that are nominated by the President Pro Tem, which is a city council member. So city council does have a couple seats to fill on this. But you can see from this, it's not just people who are developing things like development corporations and affordable housing advocacy organizations, but it's also people who have experienced homelessness and people who have a low enough income to qualify for housing assistance, or even a homeowner who's at or below 200% of the poverty guidelines. So you have a wide range of people who don't have a personal interest in making money off of this Affordable Housing Trust Fund, right? These aren't developers. These aren't people who are putting money in their pocket. These are people who have been working on this issue and understand it from a very intimate perspective as a social service provider, or as a person who's experienced homelessness or has housing, who qualifies for housing assistance. But the City Hall's plan, and this was passed last week, and this is one of the most disheartening parts of all of this, is that this was passed. And so the mayor now will have the ability to control the housing board, the Affordable Housing Board, the Housing Advisory Board. And, ultimately it just has bank lenders, for-profit builders, for-profit developers, real estate brokers, city council members, anyone to provide balanced advice, whatever that means. And this was passed last week. So this is kind of what's at stake. Now you have, as we just learned, a fund, that's being created that can go towards anything. It can go towards luxury apartments, it can go towards parking garages. And now it's being controlled by the same people who are building luxury apartments and building parking garages, because they're picked by the mayor. We don't know how many people are going to be on this board. We don't know what the terms are, if they're term limited or anything like that. But they passed last week legislation out of City Hall approving both that $34 million from HUD and the Section 108, which can go to anything. Again, it can go to parking garages, it can go to businesses, it can go to luxury housing. And now they pass this board, same time, they pass this board that can decide where that money goes. And it does not have to go towards affordable housing. So what this also means is that because there's so much housing pressure in Cincinnati. We have a lot of white generational wealth coming back in from the suburbs after, whole generations of people building their wealth out in the suburbs because of federal programs like the Homeownership Loan Corporation. I suggest you check out some of our trainings like our 101 and our 201 to learn more about this, more deeply about this. But the city is offering incentives for those white generational wealth people to come back in the city because they see the biggest success is if we increase our earnings revenue, our earnings tax revenue, right? So they're trying to bring in people so that they can have more of an earnings tax. And what that does is it incentivizes pushing out people, especially low-income people, and especially Black people, and entire communities of people have been pushed out of Cincinnati. As we said before, 1,000 Black residents leave Cincinnati every year by design. And so what issue 3 does is it strengthens the tenant protections with what's called just cause eviction. And you can see on the bottom what that means. It means, if you're repeatedly breaking the law and you're, violating the lease and you haven't, followed up with a corrective action plan with your landlord, then yes, you can be evicted. But you shouldn't be just evicted because your landlord wants a different person to live in here who has more money or just need, we want to move everybody out for this. And so this makes sure that the tenants are protected, and it also strengthens some of the racial discrimination protections because of the board itself will include somebody who has a fair housing background. And since we have such high rates of eviction in Hamilton County, and CMHA being the largest evictor in the county, and those evictions having a lifelong impact, is really important for us to understand that we need to try to stop these as much as possible. Now, the state of Ohio is working on legislation right now that will hopefully allow people to expunge their eviction record after 7 years. But until that's done, people are being held back because of their evictions. And so what issue 3 does is it strengthens those protections. And we know that Black women across this country and in Hamilton County, if you stand out and watch eviction court, they are the most impacted by evictions. So if we look at these plans side by side, and this is going to be the end of this right here, we can see that there's a marked difference between issue 3 and City Hall's plan. Now, City Hall's plan will continue unabated unless we vote yes on issue 3. If we vote yes on issue 3, we will have dedicated funding towards affordable housing. As it stands now, there is no dedicated funding towards affordable housing in the City Hall's plan. Again, they can use it for parking garages, luxury housing. That's the way it is. They even said only 50% or more might go to affordable housing. They also don't have just cause eviction protections. There's no livable wage guarantee, whereas we have that in issue 3. We are equity focused. Theirs is looking at trickle down housing and white supremacist ideology that they keep presenting over and over and over again, like they don't realize what they're doing. Our program is community controlled, unlike the mayor, who is able to control the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So this is a big deal. This is why people need to vote yes on issue 3, because what we're going to see is more of the same. And they're going to keep telling us, oh, we're creating 350 units every year with $1 million, when really that's not the case. So we want to make sure that you talk to your friends and your family and your neighbors about voting yes on May 4th. Early voting has already begun. You can also check out Cincinnati Action for Housing Now at actionforhousingnow.com for more information. Follow the Homeless Coalition on here. We keep posting updates. You can follow Cincinnati Action for Housing on Facebook as well. There's some great videos to check out. There's a lot of people who are talking about why they support this and why it's important for us to pull back the inaccuracies and the untruths that are being told to us about what the city is doing and what they plan to do, and make sure that this is a community controlled fund that will actually create affordable housing. So we have a lot of work to do. Please go ahead and share this video right now. If you stuck through this all the way through this, I really appreciate it. Go ahead and hit share so other people can see this. And then check us out. Mona will be back with me on Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the Mona and Mark show. So I hope everyone has a great day. Take care. Bye.